Mr. President, I come to the floor to speak in opposition to the nomination of Bryan Bedford to serve as the FAA Administrator, the Federal Aviation Administration. Everyone knows that the FAA is at a critical point in history. The tragic mid-air collision that we had in D.C. on January 29th took the lives of 67 people and made it clear what was at stake to all of us. The National Transportation Safety Board is in their subsequent findings earlier this year, said that over 15,000 close calls took place around DCA over the past 3 years alone, demonstrating that we in the aviation industry have much more work to do to raise the safety bar. The FAA and its workforce are facing historic challenges. Within weeks of the DCA crash, the Trump administration fired hundreds of FAA officials, including technical operational staff, who help make it possible for air traffic controllers to do their jobs, and specialists who design FAA flight routes and maps. With air traffic system outages and a clear directive from Congress to implement stronger safety regulations, career officials with decades of aviation experience have been pushed to leave. Just to be clear, I'm referring to the fact that we passed an FAA 5-year authorization, and we said we need stronger safety regulations, and we need more on-hands experience, not shortcutting the individuals that are helping us implement safety plans. As a result, senior leaders at multiple FAA lines of businesses have already left or are in the process of leaving, and the FAA has lost about 3% of its workforce, more than 1,200 employees, to the deferred resignation program. An FAA presentation obtained by the Wall Street Journal in May revealed that the FAA is internally sounding the alarm about the impacts from those staffing shortages. There are warnings that the agency's ability to work on runway safety, process medical clearances for air traffic controllers, and fulfill its statutory and regulatory requirements were all at risk. The next FAA administrator will have an overreaching mission that it will be a huge challenge, ensuring the United States remains the global gold standard for aviation safety. And in order to keep 2.9 million commercial airline passengers safe each day, the next administrator must prioritize investing in the FAA's safety workforce. These challenges underscore why we should have an administrator who is willing to strengthen the safety standards instead of seeking ways to go around them. As we have looked at the record of aviation safety, Mr. Bedford has been on the front lines, obviously working in the aviation sector, but also in a frontline effort to roll back safety reforms and unravel the regulatory framework that has made the United States that gold standard. Since 1999, Mr. Bedford has been the president and CEO of Republic Airways, one of the largest regional airlines in North America. And for a decade, he has consistently fought to change the FAA's 1,500-hour rule, which is a key safety provision that was placed in law 2013 following the tragic crash of a regional jet, Colgan Air Flight 3407 near Buffalo, New York, that killed 49 people. The rule sets strong pilot training and first officer qualification standards to ensure that both pilots have the appropriate experience to react in an in-flight emergency. Instead of recognizing how this rule went and the public debate and notice and comment period, Mr. Bedford has called it arbitrary. That means the FAA went through a very big process, but Mr. Bedford thinks that was arbitrary and, quote, does nothing to further the goal of increased flight safety, end quote. Mr. Bedford has then led a trade association that spent millions of dollars lobbying against the 1,500-hour rule and other pilot training policies, including as recently as the first quarter of this year. And in 2022, Mr. Bedford's company petitioned the FAA for an exemption from the 1,500-hour rule, and that effort failed. But as head of the FAA, he will be put in the very job that he basically tried to lobby to say, let's weaken safety standard rules. The effort that Mr. Bedford tried when he was in the private sector failed, but as I said, as the head of FAA, he could hold power over the agency to weaken what has become a very bedrock 1,500 hour to help us make sure that both pilots and co-pilots are appropriately trained. My colleagues and I gave Mr. Bedford multiple chances in our Commerce hearing, nomination hearing, to tell us that he, if confirmed, would not weaken that rule. But he repeatedly failed to give us an answer for the term of his time in office. To me, that was the evidence that I needed to understand. If the 1,500-hour rule had been in place since the Colgan Air tragedy, could it be at risk if Mr. Bedford was confirmed? Mr. Bedford would not commit to recusing himself from ruling on his own company's exemption request from the 1,500-hour rule for the entirety of his 5-year term as FAA Administrator. In other words, he could decide to grant his own company an exemption, the same thing he tried to do when he was in the private sector lobbying the FAA. Mr. Bedford's hearing testimony was so concerning that the Colgan Air Flight 3407 families have publicly opposed his nomination. These are families who have become the bedrock of safety. They move forward with their lives, but they also come to Capitol Hill each year to protect aviation safety. The families said that Mr. Bedford's clear aim to weaken the 1,500-hour rule, quote, sends the wrong message to the American passenger and every family that has ever boarded a domestic flight, end quote. This represents, I think, a very big challenge for us right now. Too often, operating under tight profit margins and resource constraints, we see challenges in our aviation system. What we need is a proactive administrator. We need somebody who is fighting for the safety improvements to prevent the accidents in the first place. And at this critical moment, we need an FAA administrator who will break from the reactive safety culture and provide the proactive safety leadership that we need to prevent problems before they happen. Captain Sully Sullenberger, the pilot on the Miracle on the Hudson, is also opposing Mr. Bedford's nomination. Captain Sullenberger abruptly recognized that Mr. Bedford, quote, is not willing to uphold the currently important pilot experience requirements put in place in 2010 that have been so effective in ensuring the safety of the traveling public, end quote. He went on to warn that, quote, with the nomination of Bryan Bedford to the FAA Administrator, my life's work could be undone, end quote. I'm sure that Sullenberger was talking about the importance of having two pilots. Once at a hearing before the Commerce Committee and asking him about the 1,500-hour rule, I asked Captain Sullenberger about this rule. He said in an emergency, you really don't even have time to talk. The two pilots both need to be doing their jobs and doing it well. So Mr. Bedford has also signaled an openness to something else I have concern about, green-lighting a single pilot on commercial flights. This is a real issue. The FAA's European Civil Aviation Authority counterpart, EASA, is thinking about certifying extended single pilot operations on commercial aircraft. That means it's being debated in Europe. It could be debated in other places. That's right, they're debating whether to have just on a long-haul flight one pilot. In 2019, when Mr. Bedford was discussing the emerging technologies underpinning single pilot operations, he said, quote, does it work? Question mark. It works. Can it work highly, reliably, and safely? I think it can, end quote. Well, you don't have to be an expert in understanding the risk of flying with just one pilot. In the past, aviation incidents have been documented by the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, and they have cited that pilot incapacity or mental health emergencies as justifications for requiring two pilots on a commercial flight. I don't care how good the technology is, if an emergency happens, we need two well-trained pilots on the flight deck at all time. Mr. Bedford has given many opportunities to talk about these past statements and how he sees the world, but again, he did not change from that commitment. Mr. Bedford has also talked about the fact that there would be no adverse impacts from the 1,500-hour rule. He also, when asked by Senator Lujan at the committee if he thought so-called DEI policies contributed to the collision near DCA earlier this year, which President Trump originally alleged, Mr. Bedford flipped and said he had no earthly idea, end quote. So we need to make sure that we're selecting a nominee who has a track record, who will help implement a proactive FAA. I know that in this past, we've had other nominees at the FAA, Mr. Bradford, who I also did not agree with, who is now trying to implement kind of changes of 10-for-1 rules. It used to be 2-for-1, get rid of 2, and you can have 1. Now they're talking about getting rid of 10 and having 1. I don't agree with that philosophy. DOT lawyers now can recommend important disciplinary action for agency employees charged with enforcement duties if the employees don't abide by the administration's decision not to enforce certain regulations. So if somebody says get rid of 10 rules at the FAA and have 1, you're going to do that if you basically are going to be charged with by somebody saying you're going to be fired over that. The Washington Post has characterized this move as, quote, a chilling effect on enforcement, end quote. And as I said earlier, DOT inspectors and investigators will fear that they could be fired just for doing their job, ensuring the safety of the flying public. We don't, Mr. President, need a light touch. We need to make sure that the industry and some of the issues are heard, but they shouldn't be the dominant answer. The FAA needs to implement the gold standard for aviation safety. I know that these issues are going to continue to push all of us here to do our jobs. There are so many things that we need to do to implement a safety management system at the FAA to make sure that Boeing, after the 737 MAX crashes, also implements a required safety management system. So I want to make sure that an administrator is not going to try to halt that rule, but get that rule implemented so that we know that manufacturing and the FAA is making the flying public safer every day by doing their jobs in the system. So, Mr. President, I ask my colleagues to please turn down the nomination of Mr. Bedford. I think we need an FAA person who can stand up in our comment phases before our committee and in this job to make really tough decisions to put the priority of the flying public first. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.